Hi, welcome to my Parsha Shir. Today we're going to hear about Parshas Bamidbar. Actually, to be more accurate, we will hear about Sefer Bamidbar, the whole book. And thank you so much to Susan Grayson for sponsoring this week's Parsha Shir in memory of her grandfather, Morris Jonah Karnowitz. Moshe Yonah ben Eli David HaKohen, Zichron Livroch, whose yahrzeit is on the 3rd of Sivan. Beis Neshama, have an aliyah, and may we all be zocher to see Tchias HaMesim. Students of the 5 books of the Torah know that for the most part the Torah makes narrative sense. The books are chronological, and with very few exceptions the flow is coherent, it's logical, it's even literary. Now it's true that sometimes the pace slows to a bit of a crawl, and at other times the Torah leaps across decades in a single pasuk, in a single verse. There are times when we get endless detail, and then there are other times when we are left grasping for context. But in the final analysis, it is always all in keeping with a story that needs to be told and information that is somehow always relevant to the quote-unquote reader. As the modern scholar of Hebrew and modern literature, Professor Robert Alter notes in his book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, by learning to enjoy the biblical stories more fully as stories, we can also come to see more clearly what they mean to tell us about God, about man, and about the perilously momentous realm of biblical history. What's also important for us to understand is that each of the 5 books of the Torah serves its own narrative function. It's independent of all the others. If Sefer Bereshis is the origin story, a sweeping account of family dynamics, moral discovery, and the first stirrings of the covenant, if Sefer Shemot is the epic of nation building, slavery, liberation, law-giving, and the forging of identity, and if Sefer Vayikra is the blueprint for holiness, korbanot, purity, sacred spaces, and the daily rhythm of divine service, and if Sefer Devarim, the final book, is the swan song of our greatest prophet Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, and addresses the preparation of the nation for the conquest of the Promised Land, then what is Sefer Bamidbar about? The answer, in simple terms, is that Sefer Bamidbar is where the ideals, which are so central to the Torah, hit the ground for the Jewish nation in a practical sense. Literally, it's a book of tents, of sand, of complaints, of rebellions, of death, of travels, of censuses, of talking donkeys, and of fiery serpents. This is Torah meeting reality. A holy nation, newly formed, begins its messy, painful transition from theory to practice. And Bamidbar begins with incredible structure. A census is taken, tribes are counted and positioned, the Mishkan is at the center of the camp, everything is poised for a triumphant march into the Promised Land. And then the wheels fall off. Barely a few chapters in, the complaints begin. The Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, want meat. Miriam and Aaron question and criticize Moshe. Then comes the big one, the Meraglim, the spies, whose slanderous report triggers national panic. That moment changes everything. The dream of entering the land is postponed, and an entire generation is sentenced to die in the wilderness. Then it gets even worse. Korach stages a rebellion against his cousins, Moshe and Aaron. Who put you in charge? He provocatively asks them, with 250 notables behind him. And in response, the earth literally opens up its mouth to swallow him up whole. There's also the plague of serpents. There's the people's grievances against Moshe and Aaron. And eventually, Moshe himself fails God and the nation at Mei Merivah and is told he will not be entering the Promised Land either. But it's not over, because all of a sudden we're back in gear. In the final chapters of Bamidbar, we're in year 40, the new generation is standing on the brink of the Promised Land, and the Torah kicks into high drama. Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet, tries to curse the people and fails spectacularly. The Midianite women seduce the Israelites. Zimri and Cosbi die in a blaze of zealotry by Pinchas. Moshe's successor is appointed. The daughters of Tzelofchad argue for inheritance rights and win. Cities of refuge are set up. Tribal boundaries are discussed. It's all very forward-looking. In other words, the book begins with military and spiritual readiness, descends into crisis and rebellion, and ends with a new generation poised for conquest. But the big question is this: what happens in between all of that? In other words, after the dramatic opening chapters and before the dramatic closing chapters, what was going on for the nation? We're not talking about a few weeks or months. We're talking about 38 years. Did you hear that? 38 years. It's a long time. What was going on for 38 years? It's not a pause. It's a generation. The answer is, as far as we can tell from the Torah narrative, nothing. Nothing was going on. Apparently, an entire generation died in silence. The Torah records no speeches, no travels, no wars, no lessons. It's like a film with missing reels, a book with missing chapters, a computer program with missing coding. One moment the people are in disarray, and the next, well, we don't know. The screen goes dark. The next scene doesn't come until 38 years later, when the story suddenly springs back to life. To understand what's really going on in Sefer Bamidbar, and particularly how to make sense of its silencers, we need to zoom out. The early commentators didn't just parse the grammar or only list mitzvot. They were also reading the book as a coherent spiritual document. And the way they frame the purpose of Sefer Bamidbar gives us a powerful set of tools to understand what it is and what it isn't. Let's begin with Ramban. In his opening comments on Bamidbar, he notes that Bamidbar begins quite specifically after the completion of the Mishkan and the giving of the laws in Sefer Vayikra. From this moment on, he says, the people were meant to be on the move, not just physically through the desert, through the wilderness, but spiritually toward their national purpose. Ramban sees Sefer Bamidbar as the bridge between God's revelation and national responsibility. Mount Sinai was not the goal. It was merely the launch pad. The Torah was given, the Mishkan was built, the people were counted and organized, and now it's time to go. Let's move onwards and upwards. But that journey, as we know, becomes far more complicated than expected. According to Ramban, Bamidbar is not about travel. It's more about transition. The transition from being passive recipients of divine law to becoming active participants in a covenantal mission. And as it turns out, that transition is fraught, which is why the wheels fell off. That's why there was rebellion and failure, because that's what happens when ideals meet reality. Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, writing in 19th century Germany, offers a broader, perhaps more psychological view of Sefer Bamidbar. In his introduction to the fourth book of the Torah, Bamidbar, he calls it the book of the nation's journey, not just through space, but through a crucible of growth. Rav Hirsch describes the book as charting the adolescent period of the Jewish people. The national camp is no longer static at Sinai. The people are on the move. They are encountering external threats and internal fissures. And like any group in transition, they stumble, they complain, they lash out, they test their leaders, and they test their God. But for Rav Hirsch, that's the whole point. It's exactly the point. Growth isn't linear, never. Not for individuals and not for a nation. A nation doesn't go from slavery to sanctity in a straight line. It can't. The journey of Bamidbar is messy, but it's necessary. It's a story of growing pains. And finally, we have the Netziv of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin in his Hamek Dover commentary. He reads Bamidbar as a kind of spiritual field manual, a book that highlights the tension between divine ideals and human shortcomings. The Netziv emphasizes how even in a perfectly structured camp, with the Mishkan at the center, the Leviim in place surrounding it, and the tribes aligned with each other, in a perfect arrangement, like a heavenly army, things can still go wrong. Why? Because people are people. They forget, they fear, they rebel, they want meat, they get jealous. So while the divine ideal may be pure, the human response to divine ideals is often flawed, even for the greatest of people, like those who left Egypt in a blaze of glory and received the Torah directly from Hashem at Mount Sinai. As I always like to say, whatever you do, don't judge a religion by its practitioners. And this, says the Netziv, is the real story of Bamidbar. It's not a book of neat theology. It's not a sanitized spiritual narrative. It's real life, a documentation of the struggle to live a godly life in a deeply imperfect world. All three of these commentators, Ramban, Rav Hirsch, and the Netziv, are telling us that the silence in the middle of the book is not accidental. It's part of the theme. Once the first generation fails to rise to the occasion, the narrative pauses, not because the Torah has nothing to say, but because the people have nothing to show. And that's exactly where Chazal, the sages of the Talmud, of the Midrash, step in and they fill the void. They offer us Midrashim that help us understand what it means to live in the spiritual quiet. Because after all, what actually did happen during those lost decades? Remember, 38 years of silence. So, while the Torah gives us no stories, no recorded journeys, no new laws, no divine speeches, Chazal were not content to leave the silence entirely unexplained. The Midrashim and classic commentators do dig beneath the surface and offer us haunting, sometimes poetic visions of what life was like for the generation that was doomed to die in the wilderness. The Sifri on Bamidbar offers one of the most striking insights. It tells us that after the sin of the Meraglim, the spies, God stopped speaking regularly to Moshe. The prophetic pipeline was choked, as it were. Divine communication diminished. In other words, and this is quite shocking if you think about it, the silence was actually real. It's not just a literary omission, but a real spiritual distance. God didn't utter a word to Moses or Aaron or anyone else for 38 years. And that's why there is this gap in the Torah at the heart of Sefer Bamidbar. Medrash Tanchuma in Chukas paints another kind of bleak image. The narrative silence is a reflection of the meaninglessness of what was going on. The generation that had rejected the land of Israel simply wandered around in circles with no destination. Their lives became a slow motion unraveling, a daily march to nowhere. How would you describe a car driving down a boring freeway at a steady 60 miles an hour for 1,000 miles? There's nothing to say, right? It's monotony on steroids. And that's what's going on for the Jewish people for 38 years, which is why there was nothing to say. Bamidbar Rabbah, another Medrash, takes a more introspective approach. It compares the Israelites to a person who is recovering from serious illness. Sometimes, says the Midrash, healing can only happen in silence. It wasn't all about punishing the people. The people were also undergoing a slow internal transformation. The silence was therapeutic, a necessary stillness before renewal. And finally, we have one more, Rashi, on Dvarim Perik Beis Pasuk Yud Daled. He gives us the most blunt explanation of all. The narrative resumes only once all the men who sinned at the time of the Meraglim had died. As long as they were still alive, nothing worth recording happened. The Torah's silence is a mirror of history's pause. In other words, the story didn't stop, but nothing happened that the Torah wanted us to remember. Or perhaps more accurately, something was happening, but it was happening in silence. Which brings us to Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who explains why the silence itself may be the most spiritually powerful message of all. The silence, says Rabbi Sacks, is where the deepest message lies. In his characteristically elegant style, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks turns our attention not to what is in the text of Sefer Bamidbar, but to what isn't in the text of Sefer Bamidbar. In his essay on Parashas Bamidbar, which he titled The Sound of Silence, he invites us to listen, really listen, to what the Torah is doing when it offers us nothing but white space across nearly 4 decades of desert wandering. Why doesn't the Torah record anything from those 38 years? Because, says Rabbi Sacks, the Torah is teaching us about the spiritual discipline of silence. And there is no better setting for silence than the Midbar, the wilderness. He reminds us that Midbar, the Hebrew word for wilderness, for the desert, shares a root with dibur, daber, speech. Paradoxically, the place of no words becomes the place where true speech and true inner change can begin. It is in the wilderness that the Israelites hear the voice of God, writes Rabbi Sacks. But to hear that voice, they have to learn to be silent. Silence is more than the absence of sound. It is a presence in its own right of calm, of humility, of attentive listening. We live in a world that usually equates progress with noise, whether it is information, updates, accomplishments, data. But Sefer Bamidbar offers us a radical counterpoint. Progress, in the Torah's moral vocabulary, is often slow, internal, and invisible. Sometimes God works in quiet, in total silence. Sometimes the most important transformations are unspoken. There are times, Rabbi Sacks continues, when the most powerful reply is silence, not because we have nothing to say, but because we are listening, absorbing, undergoing change. He compares the Israelites' silence in the wilderness to the silence that follows trauma. The nation had suffered multiple spiritual failures, rejecting the land, rebelling against their leaders, doubting God. The years that followed weren't a punishment so much as a rehabilitation. The old generation had to fade quietly. The new generation had to emerge without fanfare. The Torah doesn't record what happened because the work being done wasn't fit for public viewing. Not everything is. It was the slow, painful work of spiritual reorientation, of internalizing Torah, of burying not only a generation, but a mindset. In Judaism, Rabbi Sacks writes elsewhere, silence is the space in which the soul grows. So perhaps the silence of those 38 years isn't empty at all. Perhaps it's sacred. It is the silence of a people learning to listen. It is the silence of failure being transformed into maturity. It is the silence before the sound, the loud noise of redemption. It's certainly no coincidence that when the Torah finally breaks its silence in the 40th year, it does so with loss. Miriam dies. Aaron dies. Moshe is told he will not enter the land. It is the end of an era, and yet from this silence a new voice begins to rise, the voice of Yehoshua, the voice of the next generation. Rabbi Sacks helps us reframe the silence as a message, not a mistake. These 38 years are a silence filled with meaning, with struggle, with the hope that sometimes growth happens not through noise or fanfare, but through the quiet determination to begin again. Okay, so the Torah goes completely silent for almost 4 decades, and we've heard explanations as to why that should be, but let's be honest, an entire nation doesn't just vanish off the map. Something had to have been happening during all that time, right? It turns out that while the Torah says nothing, the Midrashim and Rashi and other commentators do offer us scattered clues, like someone whispering from behind a curtain. And if you piece them together, a picture does emerge, not of drama, but of quiet, repetitive, and emotionally weighty routine. Let's start with the big one. How many times did the Israelites actually move during those 38 years? We know from Bamidbar chapter 33 that the Israelites had 42 encampments over the 40 years of wilderness wandering. But here's the twist. They weren't moving constantly. According to Rashi, most of those moves happened during 2 periods. In year 1, during the initial flurry of travel post-Exodus, and in year 40 as the new generation made its way towards the Jordan River. What about in between? Apparently, there were just 8 stops over 38 years. That's barely a move every 5 years. So no, they weren't actually aimlessly wandering around the desert like lost hikers. They were mostly settled, especially in places like Kadesh, where according to several sources, like Rashi, Ramban, and Sifri and Devarim, they may have stayed for up to 19 full years. This is already telling. The physical stillness reflects the spiritual stagnation. The generation sentenced to die wasn't on a journey anymore. They were in a holding pattern. But, and this is interesting, even in that holding pattern, a few things were happening. Medrash Tanchuma paints a haunting picture of those years. Each Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the Israelites who came out of Egypt would dig their own graves and lie down in them, knowing that some among them would not rise the next morning. Those who remained alive would cover the graves of those who had perished. It was a grim annual ritual performed not once, but year after year after year for 38 years, as the generation condemned to die slowly faded away. It was national mourning in slow motion, a people grieving its own future before it had even arrived. But even as one generation was dying off, another was quietly being raised. According to the Sifri and Devarim, while the older Israelites counted their days, their children were growing up in the shadow of the Mishkan. Perhaps there were no great revelations or dramatic miracles during those 38 years, but the Leviim continued to teach Torah, and Moshe continued to transmit the halacha. A new generation was being formed, not in fire and thunder, but in the quiet constancy of faith, family, and daily life. And despite everything, God did not withdraw his presence. As Rashi notes on Dvarim Perik Beis Pasuk Zayin, the miraculous care continued unabated. The man still fell. The water from Miriam's well still flowed. Their clothes didn't wear out, and nor did their shoes. The silence may have felt like abandonment, but it wasn't. It was discipline wrapped in love, a quiet that still held them all together and in safety. From Moshe's retrospective in Sefer Dvarim, we also know that there were occasional threats, unrecorded skirmishes and military disputes that required divine protection. Sefer Bamidbar suggests that Hashem's safeguarding hand remained upon them even when the Torah chooses not to tell us the details. To be clear, those incidents weren't forgotten because they weren't important. They were simply not formative. They didn't shape the nation's destiny. They weren't covenantal moments. So, the 38 years weren't entirely empty. There was tragedy, there was growth, there was survival, there was schooling, and there were miracles and mercy. It just didn't make it onto the front pages of the Torah, because what was happening wasn't meant to be seen. It was meant to be absorbed. As we said earlier, the story didn't stop, but the camera stopped rolling. Or maybe the Torah just put its microphone up to the silence, because the silence was the story. Sefer Bamidbar is best known for its drama, for the stories of spies, rebellions, fiery punishments, and divine interventions. But perhaps its most profound message lies exactly in the silence. The 38 unspoken years remind us that not all spiritual growth is loud. Not every lesson comes with thunder and lightning. Sometimes the most important work happens in the quiet. Raising children, learning Torah, healing from failure, waiting patiently for renewal. The Torah may not tell us what happened during that time, but by not telling us, it teaches us that waiting, surviving, and persevering in the wilderness is itself holy. The wilderness years were not wasted, they were preparation. And in that preparation, in that sacred silence, the future was quietly born. God is in the silence between the sounds, the pause between the words, wrote Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. To hear him, all we need to do is listen. And perhaps that's the most profound message of all that we can gain from Sefer Bamidbar. In the end, it's not the noise of activity that matters, but rather the quiet, sacred stillness of growth and belonging. And if it takes 38 years of silence and omission in the Torah to learn that lesson, so be it, because it's a lesson well worth learning. And with that, I will leave it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you.